mean, this is just the latest of risky projects, half-baked plans, bad policies. And today, we're reading about a serious lack of just basic oversight. So the auditor didn't even provide new recommendations to the government because Travis Toews failed to act on the last batch of recommendations that were made directly to him on these matters. Why haven't they been implemented? I think that's a question for Travis Toews, but I'll provide a little bit more context. The Auditor General earlier this year, who is a member of the Public Accounts Committee, approached the Public Accounts Committee and said, I am doing COVID-19 audits, and I would like to present those findings in the month of June to the Public Accounts Committee, publicly, so we can have a public conversation. What did the UCP MLAs do? In my view, this was unprecedented. I have looked across the country. I have never seen this happen. The UCP MLAs said, no, thank you, Mr. Auditor General. We don't want to hear from you. They voted down his appearance that he had requested to come and discuss this report at Public Accounts and make sure that it got the sunlight that it needed. Now, Alberta's NDP believes that Albertans have a right to hear from the Auditor General about how their money is spent. It's a pretty basic tenet of our democracy, but the UCP do not. Travis Toews is no fiscal genius. He's as unaccountable and untrustworthy as Jason Kenney. So, I'm here today to commit that if Albertans elect an NDP government in 2023, we will hold a public inquiry into the UCP's mismanagement of the pandemic, and for the first time, we will assign the full weight of the government's internal audit committee to find out where those dollars went. And we'll make those findings public. We'll not hide the truth from Albertans as this government does. Alberta will find your $4 billion. Because Albertans deserve a government that respects our tax dollars, that tracks our progress, that fixes its mistakes, that owns them, and that knows where and how every penny is being spent to make people's lives better. Thank you, and I'll now pass things over to my colleague David Shepherd to provide further comment.
Well, thank you, Shannon. I also look forward to finding out where this money went, because the Albertans I talk to, the patients, doctors, frontline workers, they all deserve to know. I think Shannon summed it up quite nicely, but I want to talk briefly about a couple of the specifics here because they are really quite alarming. Auditor General Doug Wiley's report paints a picture of a government that didn't have a firm hand on the wheel, and it still doesn't today. For example, the audit notes that the Ministry of Health, quote, could not identify how much was spent on personal protective equipment, contact tracing, and rapid testing. Frankly, considering that our official opposition repeatedly asked the government to spend more on those initiatives, I have to wonder why they continue to claim their approach was appropriately funded, when the audit reveals they don't even know how much they spent. The audit says that the Ministry of Health, quote, did not describe what it achieved by spending $260 million in long-term care, designated supportive living facilities, and seniors' lodges. That is awful, given that this is where so many lives were lost. We know that money was critical for protecting the population most at risk from this virus, and they can't even tell us if their spending made a difference. The Ministry of Health, quote, did not disclose the number of vaccines received from the federal government. That is just ridiculous. Alberta received multiple vaccine shipments from Ottawa over a period of many months, and the UCP, this government, wants us to believe that when those vaccines arrived, no one in the government wrote it down. There was no one keeping track of what was coming in. That's just impossible to believe. The UCP must have this number, and for whatever reason, they are refusing to provide it to the people of Alberta. Think about this. Millions in transportation, child care costs, rental assistance, and no reporting on what was actually achieved. Over the course of 3 years, I've stood up almost every week and called for more transparency and accountability from this government. Yet today we see evidence that their botched handling of the pandemic from top to bottom has pushed our healthcare system to the brink, exhausted frontline workers, and created a crisis in care that continues to get worse every day. Doctors leaving, hospitals closed, emergency rooms overwhelmed, and an ambulance system that continues to be in crisis. The UCP government now claims they're spending on solutions to these problems, but here is the bigger question. If the UCP lied to you about what they spent on healthcare during COVID, what are they lying to you about today? Thank you, and we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, David. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, David. We'll now open the floor to questions. Reminder for folks joining us on the phones to press *9 on your telephone keypad to join the question queue. If you're joining us via Zoom, you can use the raise hand function and we'll join the question queue, but we'll start with questions from those in person.
Hey guys, we've heard a couple of UCP leadership candidates say that they'll also call a public inquiry into the COVID-19 response. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, we're just...
Would you get on board with, they might launch it prior to the election, I imagine. Would you get on board with a UCP launched public inquiry into this, or what would you like to see the parameters be on the one that they're bringing forward?
It's a pretty hypothetical question.
Sure is.
Certainly, and we'd have to see the parameters of it. I mean, all public inquiries are undertaken under the terms of the Public Inquiries Act. I'll remind everyone of the last time this government abused the Public Inquiries Act, which was the Allen Inquiry, where we had a number of ways in which, due process was just completely flouted. So I don't think, and it was just a complete waste of money, like a lot of other things that that this government has undertaken, these gimmicks and schemes and so on. Ultimately, I don't think that we can trust the UCP to review the UCP. And for an actual accounting of what the money was spent on, where it went, those kinds of more foundational questions, right, about fiscal management and transparency, I think for that you'd need a change of government.
They said in statements yesterday, the Finance Minister says, look, we're focused on getting, Travis Toews, focused on getting money out the door and supporting Albertans, and they're working on the reporting side of things. The Treasury Board of Finance now says, yeah, there's going to be some new policies put in place, and there's going to be COVID-19 specific sections in year-end reports. I mean, are they at least moving in the right direction, in your opinion, on that stuff? It's
a bit day late and a dollar short, seeing as the money's already been spent, for starters. Secondly, there is actually no excuse for this. I, too, I've seen this process from both sides. I, too, was involved in very lengthy, large Auditor General investigations and reviews of, for example, the Climate Leadership Plan. The kind of very specific and frankly damning language that we see in this Auditor General report shows me that the Finance Minister did not respond to the Auditor General with their very legitimate queries. They did not cooperate with the Auditor General. And that's how you see this kind of language coming out. This is explosive language for a group of accountants. And so what we have here is the Auditor General using the only power that he has, which is to go straight to the public, because it's very clear that he was stonewalled by the Finance Minister in particular. Responding to these kinds of large-scale audits is absolutely dependent on tone from the top. I have seen this process from the inside, and it is absolutely iterative. If you cooperate with the Auditor General, you will go back and forth and so on, and ultimately, at the end of the day, they will make some recommendations. It's very clear what happened here was the original recommendations that the AG made last year were completely ignored, and then the entire process of the AG inquiring after this $4 billion was completely stonewalled. We cannot trust these people to answer basic questions of fiscal oversight, and in particular, we can't trust Travis Toews with that.
David, I can get you on another topic if I can. The Safe Supply report was posted online this morning. There's a number of recommendations on there, including providing safe supply in a clinical setting. At first blush, what do you make of this report and the recommendations?
So I haven't had a chance to really review the report that closely so far. What I can say is we saw going into this an awful lot of toxicity from this government towards reasonable steps in terms of harm reduction in general. We saw them close down supervised consumption sites in Lethbridge and here in Edmonton, and we have been living with the results since that. I mean, Shannon can speak to the impact in Lethbridge. I've certainly seen it here in downtown Edmonton. Regarding the report itself, we saw pretty early on that they knew exactly what they were going to say and what they wanted to accomplish long before the committee was struck. This report was written, I think, before the committee ever actually met. And we have seen throughout the process that there have been serious concerns raised by academics around one of the key reports of academic research and some very problematic methodology that has been included in the Safe Supply report. So we continue to support the 3 calls we put forward last year, that we need to reopen supervised consumption sites and expand them across the province to help deal with the immediate crisis. Let's be clear, that committee sat for about 200 days, and we've had approximately about 2 deaths per day. About 5 deaths per day. Over 200 days. That's about 1,000 people that lost their lives during the course of this review that the UCP chose to strike. So we need to reopen and expand SCS. We need to provide, yes, a very limited program of offering prescribed medication for individuals who have been unable to find success in any other form of recovery or stability. And we need to be looking at offering drug testing, so that we can ensure that individuals have some protection against an increasingly toxic drug supply that is driving this poisoning crisis and costing us lives on the street.
Follow up on that topic, Bill?
Your party walked out on this committee, decided not to take part in this after the first couple of days. Do you feel that you could have accomplished more had you stayed in, or do you still stand by that decision to not take part in this?
Again, it was quite clear from the beginning. We did attend at the beginning. We sat through the initial process where we were selecting individuals, and we saw quite quickly that the government was looking to set up a rigged political circus. We simply chose not to participate in that. As I said, about 1,000 people have likely lost their lives during the 200 days during which the UCP staged these committee hearings, brought forward a report that has been called deeply problematic by many in the academic community, much like their previous review of SCS and their claims that they cause crime. So frankly, yeah, I think we made the right decision. We have important work to do on behalf of Albertans. We continue to propose real concrete policy that can make lives better, and when it comes to the drug poisoning crisis, save lives. And that's what we're going to continue to focus on doing.
It's Jeremy with the CTV. I guess back on the COVID spending. In the AG report, it mentions that across these annual reports from ministries, they couldn't really compare dollars spent, objectives, and results.
Yep.
Like, what else is there?
There isn't anything else. That's the literal job description for any minister leading any department, and for the Premier's office, and more specifically for the Finance Minister. That tone that comes from Treasury Board and from the Finance Minister's office is what sets the direction for how individual ministers are going to respond to AG recommendations and what's going to be in annual reports. And quite frankly, I mean, not to get too wonky here because annual reports isn't that exciting, but the fact of the matter is that results for money spent is the first thing they scrubbed out of every ministry's annual report. So when you go back and look at whatever we had between 2015 and 2019, ministry annual reports are like this. Now they're these skinny little documents that are just a bunch of sort of political statements and other, taking of victory laps that are unearned and unnecessary. They have gutted every aspect of fiscal oversight and accountability to Albertans. Travis Toews' record as a finance minister demonstrates that he does not deserve the Premier's chair because he does not respect Albertans' money.
Just to follow here, what do these findings, you think, say about kind of the what was going on in the background with the government, throughout the pandemic as they were making announcements on funding and decisions on policies and restrictions? I guess how does this fold into what was actually going on while they were addressing this pandemic?
This is a government that, through the course of its term, COVID or not, has shown Albertans that they're far more worried about themselves than they are about Albertans. And that's why Albertans cannot trust the UCP. It's very clear that Travis Toews, who now wants to sit in the Premier's chair, is a continuation of that approach of arrogance, of instability, of fiscal irresponsibility, all the hallmarks of the Kenney administration. This is, Travis Toews has demonstrated that by his record, that what he is offering Albertans is Kenney 2.0.
Thank you. We'll now go to the phone lines. Caller, you can now unmute and ask your question. It's Bill Kaufman. Go ahead, Bill.
I'm just changing gears a little bit here, but it's still dealing with COVID-19. The National Advisory Committee on Immunizations recommending booster shots this fall in advance for a possible further wave of this disease, and they're recommending this for quite a wide variety of what they're calling vulnerable populations here. What kind of faith do you have in this government in rolling this out properly?
Yes, I did see that just before I came down here this morning that there had been those recommendations brought forward by NACI. What we know is that the track record of the UCP is that they have dragged their feet so often, in so many cases, in taking the action needed to help protect our communities against COVID-19. Now, admittedly, the initial rollout of the vaccines last year, generally pretty good. First doses, second doses, I commend the government, I commend AHS, they did a reasonable job. We quickly saw that begin to fall apart when we started moving into vaccinations for younger people. When we began to move into third doses, as we saw increasingly toxic rhetoric, indeed approaching anti-vaccine rhetoric from a few UCP MLAs. And unfortunately, what we have seen is a complete plateauing of vaccination uptake in the province of Alberta, both for young people. We have one of the lowest levels of second doses for young people in Canada, certainly for those under 12. We have seen an utter plateau of third doses amongst adults, and we know that is an almost essential step for dealing with some of the current variants. And we have approaching BA4, BA5, which some are saying are even more contagious and potentially may, in fact, inflict more harm. So what we really need to see here is the government needs to step up. They need to put aside their political considerations, even though they find themselves yet again enmeshed in their leadership race. And we see folks in that UCP leadership race who, again, are spouting misinformation and toxic rhetoric. So we need to see a clear plan from Health Minister Copping about how he intends to roll out vaccinations and boosters this fall. We need to see a clear and concrete plan. We need to see that now. We don't have time for them to play games and put a new leader in the window. They need to do the work to protect and support Albertans.
Follow-up, Bill?
No, good. Thanks.
Okay, 1 sec. Just check the question. Good. You got one more? Okay, yep, go ahead.
So as you mentioned, this was, and probably Shannon for you, I think, there was already recommendations from the AG's office to make some changes as far as reporting goes. And at the end of the day, those are still just recommendations, right? So I guess what happens if nothing changes here for the government? Are there consequences, or do the recommendations become impositions at some point? What changes here?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Again, at the risk of boring everyone with accountant talk, the fact of the matter is that how this works is that the Auditor General makes recommendations to individual ministries or government-wide recommendations, and the onus is then on the departments to implement them. Now, the Auditor General then can restate those recommendations. He can come back to the Public Accounts Committee if he's not voted down by UCP backbenchers to do so, and restate those publicly, to discuss that publicly. The ultimate check here is not a rule or a law. The ultimate check here is common decency and respect for democratic institutions. And that's what we don't see from the UCP, and that's why we need a change of government if we want to restore that. That's why they've shredded the trust in government with Albertans. That's why even the members of his own party showed Mr. Kenney the door, because they cannot find it within themselves to have any respect for our money, for our processes, for oversight, and for leveling with Albertans and telling the truth when it matters the most. And I would argue that during a pandemic, the money that you are spending to keep students and seniors and all of us safe is the ultimate responsibility of government. And in that, this report shows that they failed.
And with that, we will conclude today's press conference. Thank you very much, everyone. guys still have 5 minutes?
You're good.